Good morning and welcome to the Footlight Broadcast. My name is Brian O'Kelly. I will be your host for today's adventure. Thanks for joining, broadcasting live this morning from Cottage Lake, Washington, just outside of Seattle. And today we are going to study the life and times of Jesus Christ and try and begin to answer this question, which will take us quite a long time. Who was this Jesus? So welcome. Again, my name is Brian O'Kelly. I am a Bible teacher. This is a Bible teaching broadcast, and there are resources, including all of the past broadcasts. This is number 57, so 56 prior, on a variety of Christian topics at the footlight.com website. A couple housekeeping things before we get going. You can contact me by email at brian@thefootlight.com. You can call 866-988-8311 and leave a message. I will call you back. There's live chat during the live broadcast if you're listening live on YouTube or Facebook, and I do see those. Comments on other channels. The audio podcast, by the way, is how most people get the content for this. I think it's probably easier driving than it is setting aside a time to sit in front of the video. And so it's intended to be audio first. It is listener viewer supported. You can visit the website at thefootlight.com and find the way to donate online or mail in some support if you like this kind of work and think you'd like to see more of it. You can also help by sharing the show, following the channel on Facebook, or liking the page, or subscribing on YouTube. So enough of the housekeeping stuff. This is the beginning of a study of all four Gospels. We will take each of them in turn. I expect this to take as long as 2 years, maybe more, to get in depth into the Gospels. And so if that's not of interest to you, probably this broadcast won't be. But I want to start with giving you some reasons why you may want to study all four Gospels and why this would be valuable. And so I want to note at the outset that this is not just a study for Christian believers. Whether you are sympathetic towards Christianity, just checking it out, or even if you're hostile to Christianity, I believe that you'll find benefit from this exploration of this topic. And I do believe that ignorance of the facts about the life of Jesus leaves you greatly impoverished on terms of your education about history, about culture, and about theology. So whether or not you are a Christian who wants to know more, or you are not a Christian, even hostile to Christianity, I do think you'll find value in this study. So before we spend this kind of time, because I'm talking about, literally maybe a couple years to complete the study of four Gospels, that's a lot of time on a single topic. And I think it's reasonable to ask, why would we spend that much time on a single set of documents, 4 books that are 2,000 years old? What would be the reason to invest that kind of time in this? And so there are a few reasons, and here's what they are, as near as I can tell. So number one reason would be because of the historical impact of Jesus. History for the last 2,000 years really can't be understood without knowledge of Jesus. And likely, I think Jesus maybe is, at least in my appraisal up to date, the most important historical figure in history. No one has had such an impact, and I don't believe ever will have such an impact on mankind, on society in general, on the world, on the way people live and act than Jesus. And so again, whether you're a Christian or not doesn't really matter. Jesus was an important figure. Now, there are various beliefs about Jesus. Some people believe that Jesus was an entirely invented figure, that he wasn't actually a real person who lived. That's fine. We'll talk about the reasons a little bit to believe something different. Some people believe that Jesus was a real man and just a man who developed a cult following, no different than Joseph Smith or L. Ron Hubbard or David Koresh or Jim Jones, except in the extent of his success. Some people believe that Jesus was a moral teacher, but not necessarily more so than other good moral teachers. Some take a pretty negative view of Jesus and his teaching. Others take a liberation view, saying that Jesus' central message was liberation of oppressed peoples. Muslims, of course, consider Jesus to be the Messiah, but not the Son of God, and think that the resurrection wasn't a real event. And Christians, of course, consider him to be the Son of God in the flesh, the Son of the living God, the Messiah, and in part because Jesus himself seemed to claim this in some interesting ways. And so we're going to get into studying that. So regardless of which of these views of Jesus you have, everyone believes something about Jesus. And the life of Jesus has had an impact on you and on your life where you live, no matter what you believe about him. Even if you're hostile to Jesus, you're now dealing with people who are pro-Jesus, who are active in your school boards and in your politics. And so it doesn't matter what you believe about Jesus. Jesus is having an impact on you. And so I think there's value in studying who was this Jesus and what was he about. And you might discover through this process that the teachings of the church and the teachings of Jesus aren't always the same, and that the life of Jesus, because of what you've heard compared to what is, that you may find Jesus a much more attractive, much different figure than you've been led to believe by some of the churches and by some church people. So the first reason is historical. The second reason, as near as I can tell, is cultural. Jesus and the church has had a cultural impact on the world. And again, whether you're sympathetic to the church and its mission or not, the impact of the church and now the impact of its decline in some places has been vast. And you really can't understand either history or contemporary events without understanding this phenomenon. Many of our values in society, both past, present, come directly from the teachings of Jesus. And the development of Western culture really can't be understood without understanding Jesus and the truth claims that Christianity makes. These are central to understanding our culture. And so for this reason, just as with any historical movement that's had a wide and broad impact, there's value in studying how it is that this thing called Christianity and this thing called the church grew to be so large by studying the founder and who he was and what he taught. Now, it also seems reasonable to me that if we are going to spend this kind of time and effort to ask where, to study these things, that we would ask where we would get our information. And is the information credible? So I want to address some objections right up front. Some say that the Bible has been copied too many times and can't be trusted. And I think that that's, an objection that on the surface might seem reasonable. And now I've answered this at length in episodes 2 and 3, so you have to go way back to the beginning of the Footlight broadcast, but you can do that on the website or on whatever podcast app you're on, whatever channel you're on, it should be there. And I don't want to get too deep into it, but now, because it's not the purpose of this study, but how we got the Bible, what its origins are, the evidence of its accurate transmission, those are all questions that have been adequately answered. And again, I'm not going to answer them here. So to keep the episode from being too lengthy, I want to encourage you, if those are important questions for you, that you check out those first episodes, episodes 2 and 3. So suffice it now to say that the evidence for the credibility of the Gospels is so substantial that it's not really in dispute anywhere. Whether or not these writings are in fact accurately transmitted to us is now an answered question. So the idea that they've been copied too many times and can't be trusted is something that can be thrown out, and really all but the most hostile, commentators believe that the Gospels have been accurately transmitted to us. Now, some say that the Gospels were chosen by the church to promote a narrative, and that other Gospels, for example, the Gospel of Barnabas, the Gospel of Thomas, these were left out because they didn't agree with the facts of the four Gospels, or they didn't meet the narrative of the church who wanted to control people. And this simply isn't true either. The reality is that, and again, I'll refer you back to episodes 2 and 3, and I cover these deeply, but the reality is that these other Gospels were always rejected from the very beginning because they were known to be either fraudulently authored, by people who claim to be someone like the Gospel of Barnabas was not written by Barnabas without question. It was actually written in the 14th century, and it has nothing to do with the early church. It was not authored by Barnabas. The Gospel of Thomas, all of these early Gospels and early other writings were known by the early church to be from fraudulent authors, or that they had no way to have the information they had. They were written by people who far and wide, who never knew Jesus, didn't walk with him, didn't know him. And so the content of the Gospels from people who knew him and walked with him superseded it. Now, another thing that people say is that the authors were biased, and because of that, they can't be trusted. Now, it's certainly true, no question, that the authors of the four Gospels were biased toward Jesus. And this fact on its own doesn't make them dishonest. What we need to know isn't whether or not they were pro-Jesus, it's whether or not they were honest in what they shared. And most biographers of historical figures write biographies from a position of admiration. I mean, to dig into the life of Abraham Lincoln or Julius Caesar or, whoever, pick out your historical figure, it probably requires at least a deep interest in that figure to write a biography. And most biographers of historical figures are admirers. Now, some are hostile, and that's their motivation. Even those who try to work even-handedly typically have a bias either toward or against their subject, right? And so the fact that the writer is biased one way or the other is really not a factor in whether or not they're honest. And so they may slant their commentary a little bit, but the facts of the commentary, the facts reported, generally speaking, from honest biographers, can be trusted, whatever their motivation. Now, we do have four authors of the Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Matthew is also known as Levi. He was a tax collector, a companion of Jesus. It wasn't uncommon for people to be known by more than one name. Simon Peter, right? Jacob was named Israel. So we have Paul, Saul, right? So this was common. Mark was also known as John Mark. And again, Matthew, back to the two names. Matthew was a companion of Jesus. He knew him. He walked with him. He spent time in his ministry with him. Mark, also known as John Mark, was a disciple of Peter. Not known to be a companion of Jesus, but Peter was a companion of Jesus, mentioned, of course, repeatedly in the Gospels. And Peter is really considered to be the author, if you will, of Mark. The Gospel of Mark is the Gospel according to Peter. Mark was the person who wrote it down for Peter. Luke was not a companion of Jesus. He was a physician. He traveled with Paul, and he was known to be with and have associated with the other apostles. So Luke is not a first-hand account of Jesus, but is a second-hand account considered to contain reliably gathered information from first-hand sources. And then John, of course, the Gospel according to John, John was a companion of Jesus. And some critics have disputed John's authorship of the Gospel, but those disputes have pretty much been recent 20th century disputes. And the early church accepted the Gospel of John as being authored by John from the very earliest appearances of it. A man named Polycarp, who we know was a direct disciple of John, accepted this, claimed it was the Gospel of John, and taught it as being from John. So there's really not a reason to dispute or wonder about the authorship of the Gospel of John. Now, all four of these Gospels are unnamed internally. In other words, the author never says, hey, I'm Matthew and I'm writing this down. I'm Mark and I'm writing it down. This is not, Paul opened his letters, Paul, an apostle of Jesus Christ in many cases, and so did the others in the letters and the epistles. But all four of the Gospels are unnamed internally. And so the words, the Gospel of Matthew, the Gospel of Mark, according to Mark, are typically put above the text by publishers and printers of Bibles. And the reason we know who wrote them is because this was the consistent teaching of the church from the very beginning. As these documents began to circulate, shortly after the death of Jesus, some as close as 10 years, these were attributed by the early church to the authors named now, And those claims really went undisputed until the 20th century. It's just the modern critics who claim that it wasn't. But the people who knew best in the very early days knew that these were eyewitness accounts. The case of Luke was the telling of eyewitness accounts, right? Now, so what we have are three eyewitness accounts, Matthew, Mark, and John. Because Mark was the gospel according to Peter, right? And we also have one researched account from Luke. Now, in any court in the world, any court that's ever been, there's no higher standard than an eyewitness account. Eyewitnesses are the ones who tell us the facts on things. When you have several eyewitnesses making a claim to the same set of facts, you end up with a pretty airtight case. Now, sometimes those eyewitnesses are dishonest. Sometimes they're colluding together in a scheme of dishonesty. So we need to allow that that's a possibility. But typically, when you have collusion toward dishonesty, it's for a reason of advantage to the witness or advantage for the defendant. So in other words, people get together to say, hey, let's get our story straight. Let's coordinate it. And that is the reason sometimes that eyewitness accounts may be the same but dishonest. Now, one of the complaints about the Gospels is that they're not all exactly the same. And one of the things that investigators look for when they look for eyewitness accounts is if the details match exactly, they assume there's dishonest collusion. When the details don't match exactly, but they match in most of the important points, they consider that the accounts are honest because they didn't get together and collude. The other thing is in the climate of the Roman occupation and the Sanhedrin and their conviction of Christians and going after Christians, the writers were putting themselves at substantial risk by advocating for Jesus. And so they're advocating for his divinity, they're advocating for his kingship, and in other words, there was nothing in it for the authors but trouble. Trouble was all they had coming from their attempt to write these things down. And this has been suggested, and I would also suggest that this is the primary reason that the Gospels don't have their names in it, because putting their name on it could lead them into a situation of persecution. Now, another complaint people have is that the Christian scriptures are the only thing we know about Jesus in the historical documents. And this is simply not true. We have references to Jesus in documents from Roman historians. Tacitus talked about Jesus. So did a couple other Roman historians. And then a Jewish historian who was named Josephus, who was likely to be hostile to Christianity, hostile to Jesus, also wrote about Jesus. And then the Jewish Talmud, which is certainly a hostile source to Jesus, also bears witness to the existence of Jesus. And the Talmud even calls him a sorcerer, and all of these bear witness to his execution by crucifixion. And the Talmud calls him a sorcerer and basically admits to the supernatural phenomenon associated with Jesus, even though they're a hostile source. Now, for the Christian believer, there are some reasons in addition to study the Gospels, or if you're just interested in theology in general. And these reasons expand a little bit beyond the historical and cultural reasons. Excuse me there. So for the Christian believer, the reasons to study the Gospels are a profitable use of your time and energy. So the first reason is the term Christian is one that means a follower of Jesus or a disciple. Acts 11:26 tells us that the disciples were first called Christians at Antioch. Okay, disciples is a word that means a student or a learner. Jesus said, and this is John 8:31, then Jesus said to the Jews who believed him, if you abide in my word, you are my disciples indeed. So a great many people call themselves Christians, and they think they are Christians because they're born into a Christian family, they attend church, they were born into America or another country that is dominantly Christian, yet a lot of these people, and maybe you're one of them, have never endeavored to seriously study the life of Jesus and what he taught in a way that would allow them to abide in his word. How can you abide in the words of Jesus if you haven't studied the words of Jesus, right? So abiding in the word has a dual meaning as well. It means knowing and understanding the words of Jesus, and it also means to abide in Jesus, who is the Word made flesh. So abiding in Jesus has a dual meaning. Paul tells us to imitate me. He says in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 1, he says, imitate me as I also imitate Christ. And so how can we imitate Jesus? How can we imitate his life? Paul is basically saying imitate Jesus, not imitate him. Imitate him to the extent he imitates Jesus. So how can we imitate Jesus if we don't study his life? Now, one of the reasons Paul said that is because the Gospels weren't widely distributed at this point. Paul was out there as a teacher. He was the imitation of Jesus. People couldn't study Jesus directly from the Gospels, but they could study Paul. And so the idea here is we're going to imitate Jesus. Now, how can I imitate Jesus if I haven't studied Jesus? Who he was, how he acted, what mattered to him, how he treated people, what his interactions were like, and of course, what did he teach? And so my hope for this study, even though it's going to be lengthy, is that as we study the Gospels together, that you'll develop a deeper, a more intimate view of who Jesus was, and most importantly, of what he taught. So that is the introduction today, and I'm not going to get into any of the Gospels today. That will start with the next episode, and it will be Matthew chapter 1, and we'll dig into that. I don't know if Matthew chapter 1 will be 1 or 2 episodes. There's a lot there, and every chapter we will just take them as they come. They will take as much time as they need, and we will go through the life and times of Jesus together. So with that, I will just say one more thing you can do to really help the broadcast is you can share what we have here and hit the share button on whatever channel you're looking at, listening on. Make sure you share the podcast and hit the like, follow buttons, etc. Visit the footlight.com website for all the notes, all the past episodes, all the past studies. Nothing there is for sale. Everything is free, but I hope that while it's free, it's still valuable. Thanks again. My name is Brian O'Kelly, and I will see you next time on the Footlight Broadcast.